People had run away from paying Roman taxes to hide up north in the sheltering German forests. And Germans would come down south to visit the fabled Rome of which they had heard such glorious stories. And while historians referred to quote-unquote barbarian invasions, close quote, it was actually a pretty friendly deal on both sides. When the northern forest tribes would come south, they became Roman citizens and joined the army and rose through the ranks to become Roman officers, until Gothic Germans were the majority of Rome's military, while most of the other Romans were busy elsewhere. Yet gradually the personnel composing this incomparable force ceased to be respectable elements of the empire's population. As time went on, the army became so barbarized that, by the 5th century and even earlier, the defense of the empire was quite literally in the hands of Germans. This progressive and accelerating barbarization had long been recognized as an important factor in the so-called decline and fall. The Fall of Rome, Can It Be Explained, edited by Mortimer Chambers, New York, Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, 1963, page 37 and 8, from Transactions of the Royal Society of Canada, 1958, quoting History of the Later Roman Empire by J.B. Bury, Macmillan and Company Limited, and St. Martin's Press, 1923. All might have been tolerably well, but there was a point of weakness in the imperial system, the practice of elevating Germans to the highest posts of command in the army. The German in whom Theodosius reposed his confidence and who assumed the control of affairs on his death probably believed that he was serving Rome faithfully, but it was a singular misfortune that at a critical moment, when the empire had to be defended not only against Germans without, but against a German nation which had penetrated inside, the responsibility should have devolved upon a German. Stilicho did not intend to be a traitor, but his policy was as calamitous as if he had planned deliberate treachery, for it meant civil war. The dissatisfaction of the Romans in the West was expressed in the rebellion of Constantine, the successor of Maximus, and if Stilicho had had his way, the soldiers of Honorius and of Arcadius would have been killing one another for the possession of the Illyricum. The Fall of Rome, Can It Be Explained, page 15 and 16. Illyricum was the old name for Yugoslavia, and the Holy Roman Empire took over where Rome left off. And in Italy in 1348, the Black Death killed 1/3 of the people in Italy, and in 1576 killed tens of thousands more. And then the plague came back again in 1630, when an entire third of the population of Italy died of the Black Death. At Casablanca in January of 1943, Churchill demanded that the Allies wait to invade Italy because he claimed that he needed British soldiers to occupy the Balkans first, which meant Yugoslavia, and the Allies would not land in Sicily until July of 1943, where an American company stenciled AAO-0 on their gear, which stood for anything, anytime, anywhere, bar nothing. When the Americans moved into the mainland of Italy in September of 1943, it would take until the following summer to dig themselves out of all those Italian wine cellars and get moving towards Berlin. And when the Americans had managed to get ashore in Sicily, the Russians kicked off the Battle of Kursk. And that ended any plans the British may have had for the Balkans, since Stalingrad had not fallen and the Soviets were now on their way to Yugoslavia. At the Casablanca conference that had been held in French Morocco in January of 1943, FDR had been focused on keeping Stalin from making a separate peace with Germany, because the Russians had been doing the bulk of the fighting, and it was basically their own patriotic war. The Soviets had made all the gains needed to secure their own borders, so theoretically the Russians could just stop now. and didn't need to pursue the war any further, but FDR was even more concerned that Britain would make a separate peace with Germany, and if Russia joined in the negotiated peace, the U.S. would be left out in the cold, holding an empty bag of unpaid debts to America. Allen Dulles thought the Casablanca Agreement was just a piece of paper that could be discarded as soon as Hitler was done away with. And Dulles felt a separate peace between Britain and Germany was definitely in the cards, with someone like Admiral Canaris speaking for Germany. On the 13th of March, 7 weeks after Casablanca, 2 bottles of booze and a bomb sat in an airplane with Hitler. But the bomb didn't go off, and the next week, one of the German generals volunteered to carry a bomb and blow himself up with Hitler during a tour of a war museum. But Hitler left the museum after only a few minutes, and the general had to run to the bathroom to defuse the bomb. Chief Müller. The bomb in the pockets? There were no bombs in the hands of this one either. Gersdorf is a self-important man who started waving his arms around after the war, claiming to have tried to kill Hitler with another fictitious bomb. I know who Gersdorf is. I assure you he has a guilty conscience. That's why the story about the failed bomb attempt. Maybe someone would like to know why he has a guilty conscience. We had to cover for Schlabrendorf to make it look as if he was only going to get a sentence in prison, just like his good friend Gerstenmaier. Now the two of them pose like old whores in a window claiming to be heroes. I think they have a good point after all. They really do represent the true spirit of the resistance. I must agree with this. And tell your Gavernets to do more research on his fairy tales next time. But my foresight in preserving Schlabrendorf, when I should have liked to hang him, has brought us together after all. Who would have thought it? Q. You probably. Chief Müller. I am just a simple Bavarian policeman trying to do his best. I'm not a subtle man after all. I read in some book that I was a stupid and brutal Nazi thug, so it must be true. Books never lie, do they? Gestapo Chief, page 150 and 51. Kim Philby sabotaged all the British plots against Hitler that summer of 1943 because he thought it terribly unfair for Russia to be up against the combined military of the German and British armies. And the turnabout to defeat Stalin after a separate peace with Germany would have left Yugoslavia in British hands. And Turkey didn't declare war on Germany until February of 1945, when the British Operation Veritable began to fail. The British were generally unsuccessful in obtaining their desires at Tehran, November 28th to December 1st, 1943. They hoped to postpone Overlord and the projected campaign to reopen the Burma Road, shifting the Burma equipment instead to the Aegean, but were forced to accept a May 1944 target date for Overlord, while Stalin emphatically vetoed any Turkish, Aegean, or Balkan projects. Stalin and Roosevelt did authorize Churchill to negotiate with Turkey in an effort to persuade that country to go to war on Germany, but no one had much hope that these efforts would be successful, and Roosevelt and Stalin opposed them for fear they might delay Overlord. Tragedy and Hope, page 779. The Royal Navy was always in danger of having the House of Commons cut their budget, and the original British Overlord plan required that the Americans land in Normandy with a much smaller force than either Sicily or Salerno, at which point they would serve as emissaries in bringing about a peace treaty between Britain and Germany, and the time would be ripe because the Russians would be conquered and Hitler would be dead. The treaty would leave Yugoslavia in Britain's capable hands, and France would become a British satellite, and Germany could keep Poland along with all the surrounding Germanic German-speaking territory. Because Russia had been overthrown in 1970 with books written by the German Jew Karl Marx, and because the Reds were making steady headway into the fatherland, the Jew communists had been Hitler's prime enemy, and the plan the British hatched would bring Russia to heel at the same time the Jew communists were done away with, and it had every chance of succeeding, except that the Americans would get in the way. After getting the Nazis to rob Jew communists for 3 or 4 years, their gold could be gathered and loaded onto ships in the lovely port of Trieste, and from there safely carried away to places unknown, with no one the wiser. But as word got out that the Americans were no longer allied with the British de facto, and were winning the war on their own, and reports were that Patton was marching towards Austria, the conspirators buried the stolen treasure in the remote, rugged mountains above Trieste, and the story was that some of it is still there. The treasure map in the September 1991 issue of Lost Treasure magazine showed where the Nazi gold was buried using old, outdated maps from the Austrian Imperial Navy, and the original maps had disappeared along with the treasure in an area 50 miles square that was cordoned off by the British as soon as all the Nazis vanished the day after Hitler's war ended. Had the plan succeeded, Churchill, of course, would default on his Lend-Lease, just as he expected Stalin would do. And with the fresh infusion of Odilow's gold after the war, the Royal Navy would have plenty of cash to pay natives the world over to rise up in rebellion against their governments, and that would give the Royal Navy good reason to ask Parliament for more disbursements to finance their services, as plenty of nations were calling upon the Royal Navy for help. Not only flush with material gain, the Royal Navy would become the heroes of the world, and it would be Odilow's money that had made it all possible. In the world of pirates and piracy, the end always justified the means, and besides, at the end of Hitler's war, the thieves believed all that stolen gold belonged to them because they'd had to carry it themselves over the mountains, and then down to the port of Trieste, and then when things fell apart in Monty's separate piece, they had to haul it all back up into the mountains, and that had not been easy. Odilow purportedly died a death by cyanide after being captured by a British commando squad in the mountains near the Austrian border at the end of May. And of all the cyanide suicide vials distributed among the Nazis, very few survived the war to be treasured as souvenirs or be put into museums. The British gathered up all the Germans in the Trieste sector with whom they had been conspiring, and put them into a prison in Wolfsburg with an E, or Wolfsburg with a U, 20 miles north of Bleiburg. Although that may have meant the Wolfsburg with a U castle in Hanover, 30 miles outside of Celle, where the Volkswagen People's Car was being built, otherwise known as the Strength Through Joy car, because keeping records after the 9th of May had fallen severely by the wayside. 7 million Germans died in Hitler's war, and the U.S. Marshall Plan gave $17 billion worth of aid to countries in need. And the T-bar had been invented in Austria in 1934, and after Hitler's war, occupying American troops invented the chairlift, and the Marshall Plan helped build ski lifts all across Austria. Perhaps Himmler had told the British where the stolen Jewish gold had gone before he was given the cyanide, and that would explain what went on in Istria, in Bleiburg, that month of May, and after losing the Yugoslavian poppy fields to Tito, the next best opium-growing area in the world after the Golden Crescent was the Golden Triangle. Truman sent American spies to Southeast Asia to keep an eye on the British, among them the Quiet American, and another CIA agent sent to Burma in 1952 was Aldrich Ames's father, but everyone thought he was just a schoolteacher. The State Department had been looking for people who knew anything about Indochina, and Mr. Ames was teaching Asian studies at a high school in Wisconsin. And Aldrich Ames's father accepted the job because he thought it would help him cut down on his drinking. Mr. Ames was sent to Burma on a grant from the Ford Foundation, and he took his young son Aldrich and 2 daughters with him. And Mr. Ames found plenty of alcohol at the American Club and the Lower Kenmendine Bible and Roulette Society. The word turncoat came from the American War of Independence, when the British would wear their red coats inside out to blend in with the Americans. And America's most famous traitor had been Benedict Arnold, who'd been wounded in battle twice before betraying the fort at West Point to the enemy in 1780, and the British general to whom he surrendered was named Clinton. Treason against America was committed most often for money, but drugs and alcohol were usually a factor, and the chief of counterintelligence from 1954 to 1974 was a spy named Angleton who had attended Yale and would manage 3 martinis during his lunches with his friend Kim Philby. The CIA thought drinking was not a problem because everybody did it, and Angleton's middle name was Jesus. And in 1974, Bill Colby got rid of Angleton because he was clearly out of his mind with his ranting and raving about there being a mole in the CIA. It was common knowledge that an agent had been selling secrets to the Russians, and one CIA agent had given the names of 30 American undercover spies to the Soviets in exchange for $4,020 bills from the Russians. Another spy was sending everything he could back to Russians in Prague, where he'd been born, and the Russians had their embassy in America in the old mansion built for the Pullman family, who had made sleeping coaches for the railroads. The Soviets typically served wretched Georgian wine, but they also provided excellent Russian caviar and salmon, though they served them, with earnest clumsiness, on untoasted Thomas's English muffins. Betrayal, the story of Aldrich Ames, an American spy, by Tom Weiner or Weiner. David Johnson and Neil A. Lewis, New York, Random House, 1995, page 28. After growing up in Burma, Mr. Ames's son Aldrich took 8 years to get through college, and then he joined the CIA at a time when there were over 200 known Russian spies in America, which was a lot of people to keep track of. Aldrich was promptly sent to Turkey, and then transferred to New York City when he turned 35 years old, and he was given a lovely apartment near the United Nations and provided with a lavish expense account. Aldrich got into a drunk driving accident, but nothing came of it, and the Office of Medical Services recommended that he be treated for alcoholism, but nothing happened, except that he now waited until noon to have his first drink. Aldrich Ames had affairs with 3 different women and divorced his wife of 12 years, and the court made him pay her $300 a month, so he decided to sell spy secrets to the Soviets. Aldrich went to meet with a Russian at the Mayflower Hotel, but stopped off for 2 drinks first at a bar in a Chinese restaurant, and then he ordered vodka when he got to the Mayflower, and ordered 2 more while he waited for the Russian, who didn't show up. So Aldrich walked to the Russian embassy and handed a manila envelope to the receptionist at the front desk. And as he wove through the front door, the FBI took his picture from their permanent stakeout in front of the old Pullman mansion. Aldrich went back a month later to meet his new Russian boss, and they went drinking together after the Russian gave Aldrich 500 $100 bills. And Aldrich trusted the Russians, but became afraid of the Americans, because he knew that the Americans were ruthless, and that the CIA had many Russian moles secretly spying for them. Aldrich decided that it was safe enough to hand over secrets to the Russians, because every year thousands of secret documents went missing at the CIA, since there was simply too much paperwork to keep track of. Aldrich had complete access, and he gave hundreds of pages of CIA secrets to the Russians, and he named over a dozen of their spies acting as double agents. And while a few of those would be allowed to defect to America, the majority simply disappeared. One of the top KGB spies defected, and Aldrich was put in charge of this new defector, because Aldrich was the only one who spoke adequate Russian. And the first thing the CIA learned from the defector was that the man working across the hall from Aldrich was a traitor. The defector had lost his father during Hitler's war, and had been sent to the Russian Naval Academy to become a submariner, then started working for the KGB in the Black Sea Fleet, and before defecting, he'd been having an affair with the wife of a Russian diplomat in Canada. They didn't even need Aldrich to work with the new defector because he spoke English, and as Aldrich sat next to him on the drive to Vienna, Virginia, Aldrich passed him a secret note, trying to find out if his own cover was blown. And the defector was not aware that Aldrich had turned, but Aldrich was miserable anyway because the Russian asked him not to smoke. Back at the office, the Russian asked for tea, but all he got was a glass of hot water. And the first question the CIA asked was, "Are the Russians going to attack soon?" 9 days later, Aldrich's divorce became final, and he married his girlfriend from Colombia, and her father was a politician who had studied math, and her mother was a literature professor, and she had attended an American high school and spoke English, and she also spoke Greek and French. And his new wife thought that the reason Aldrich drank too much was because he'd been married to the wrong woman. At one time, the agency had tried to prohibit marriages between officers and agents, but in the late 1970s, it had capitulated in the face of their frequency. A growing number of officers were falling in love with the foreigners they recruited, and it became a burden having to fire them or ordering the romance ended. Betrayal, page 188. Aldrich was promoted even though the rules were that agents married to foreigners had to be kept away from secret material. And an agent down the hall from Aldrich was not only drinking heavily but doing coke, and when that agent failed a lie detector test, he was put into a smaller office where he would spend his days making drunken phone calls to Moscow. Another agent was also using cocaine and selling secrets to the Russians, and 3 months after that, an agent was sentenced to life in prison. Oh, and 3 months after that agent was sentenced to life in prison, Aldrich was put in charge of the new defector. Shortly thereafter, the prize walked out of a Georgetown restaurant, leaving his salmon dinner behind, and gave a live press conference from the Soviet embassy where he claimed to have been kidnapped and given drugs by the CIA. When Gorbachev became Russia's new leader in 1985, everyone thought he was the Antichrist because of the port wine stain on his forehead. And Aldrich was still drinking and easily passing his regularly scheduled polygraph tests. And in the fall of 1986, 2 Marine guards let the KGB into the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and the CIA blamed the Marines for all the previously leaked secrets and closed the case in time for cocktail hour. Gorbachev tried to sober up Russia by stopping the state alcohol industry, and all the sugar in the country immediately disappeared as people began making their own moonshine. So the Russian government had to start selling alcohol again. Drinking to excess has not been confined to the suffering masses. Peter the Great was an epic imbiber. Stalin's entourage has been described as constantly half-sloshed, and Boris Yeltsin has been in trouble more than once for his alleged propensity for strong drink. Predicting Russia's Future by Richard Lurie, William S. Rukeyser, Editor-in-Chief, Knoxville, Tennessee, The Larger Agenda Series, Whittle Direct Books, 1991, page 10 and 11. Pan Am 103 was blown out of the sky in 1988, and any evidence of CIA complicity was covered up. And Aldrich would be promoted to chief of the Western Europe branch in September of 1989. And then the Berlin Wall came down, catching the CIA completely off guard and threatening to decimate their budget with the death of the Cold War. The agency managed to not only resurrect, but to expand their pursuit of the Great Cold War, no matter that it really was truly dead. And the whole thing was being driven by the British, who were still playing the great game. People like Aldrich had to choose between the Russians and the British, and for those unschooled in the esoterics of Anglophile sycophants, the choice was always clearly for the more friendly Russians. Aldrich was appointed Deputy Chief of Station in Moscow, but the Russians declined his appointment because it was too close for comfort, so Aldrich went back to Washington, D.C., and bought a house and a white Jaguar and a hot tub, and he put in an order for a Filipino maid. A woman CIA agent noticed that something was not quite right about Aldrich after she visited his home, and she told her boss of her suspicions, but the boss put her report in a bottom drawer, and it was soon forgotten. Nobody liked Aldrich much, and his work was quote-unquote all but useless, and he was ranked third from the bottom on the yearly review out of 200 employees. So in September of 1990 he was promoted and then promoted again. But first he was asked to review the personnel records of the hundreds of new CIA recruits. After that, he was transferred to counterintelligence, where he was supposed to keep track of everything going on in the CIA, especially supervising those agents who were monitoring what was left of the KGB. And a Russian in Germany told the CIA they had gotten an inside man into the Kremlin, so Aldrich turned him into the Russians. The suspicious woman's boss sent a memo asking somebody to look more closely at Aldrich. So Aldrich was sent some security forms to fill out, and he was given 2 months to do it, and Aldrich had another agent murdered by the time he filled out the questionnaire. The CIA sent someone down to Colombia to check up on his wife's family, even though nobody had noticed the extra $300,000 a year Aldrich had been putting away into Swiss banks. And Aldrich had claimed that the money had come from his Colombian wife, who was rich, which was not true, but every time someone pointed at Aldrich, the CIA would look at the finger. The CIA knew that nobody trusted Aldrich, but thought his secretive nature was quite normal for a spy, and Aldrich continued to pass security tests and polygraphs until the spring of 1991, when the CIA finally called in the FBI, which was harder than pulling teeth because the FBI and the CIA never got along. CIA agents were upper-class types from snooty established families who had attended Ivy League colleges, and they all knew each other, and they thought this private club of family friends would make a reliable network of secret keepers and loyal operatives. The CIA enjoyed seeing things in an historical perspective, and they had all learned from the same textbooks written by people in the same club, and they looked down in haughty grandeur at the FBI, who were more meat and potatoes types. The FBI had no patience for the elaborate plots and schemes the CIA was always hatching, accompanied by their elaborate top-secret coded cables written in increasingly complex and fancified language, and the difference between the FBI and the CIA was exacerbated by the predominance of Irish within the ranks of the FBI, as contrasted against the British-loving Anglophile CIA, who had been in bed with spies from Britain from as far back as the good old days of the American War of Independence. FDR had formally put an end to the cozy schmoozing between American and British intelligence agents in 1940 by officially complaining to the British government. And Britain had formally recalled their agents, but had kept them going in America in secret. And 50 years later, the FBI promptly made a list of possible turncoats that comprised an astonishing 29 names, and Aldrich was on the list. A few months after the FBI made the list, the person leading the investigation died of a heart attack on a golf course at the age of 49, and the man who took his place was from Little Rock, Arkansas, and he wanted to expand the CIA into the war on drugs, but he meant mostly cocaine, because he thought that coke was to people of African descent what alcohol was to Indians, while the powdered kind being snorted by polite rich people, in his view, didn't seem to be much of a problem. The guy on the X-Files named Krychek was really named Kryakov, and some people broke into his KGB headquarters in August of 1991 and painted swastikas on the wall. So Kryakov decided that the U.S. was planning to invade Russia because too many Russians were being friendly to America, and Kryakov was determined to save the Russian government when the turncoats barricaded themselves inside the Parliament building in Moscow that was called the White House, and the turncoats thought the Americans would come to their aid, but they were wrong, and Kryakov ordered an assault on the Russian White House while half of the KGB defected. Air support stayed on the ground, and the artillery stayed silent, and only the tank crews responded, but that would be enough to save the White House from the traitors. The Parliament building was reoccupied by loyal Russians, but not before a crowd had gathered around KGB headquarters shouting, "Germans! Germans!" and Kryakov was the guy that Aldrich had been reporting to. The CIA created a new task force to finish off Russia now that it was mortally wounded, and Aldrich was put in charge of the task force, and 2 months later, a turncoat KGB officer was recruited into the CIA, and he knew about the mole, but Aldrich's boss quickly decided that the new recruit was a liar. The FBI started interviewing the people on their list, but quickly ran into trouble, because the CIA didn't want any agents' names to ever be written down on paper, and a few months later, the FBI finally got around to Aldrich, but after talking to him for a half an hour, the FBI went away. The only information they had gained that was not previously known was that the CIA had declined to respond to 2 requests back in July of 1986, asking for further information about Aldrich. The FBI had photographed Aldrich coming in and out of the Russian embassy back then, and the CIA did not respond to questions the FBI had asked about that. And when the FBI looked at the newly liberated East German Stasi files, they found nothing, and it had taken over 2 months for the CIA officer in Germany to even let the FBI take a look. The FBI searched all the scheduling entries for every known U.S. and Russian spy, and they drew time charts on butcher paper that they would roll and unroll like Torah scrolls, but all their work would come to nothing. That Christmas, Aldrich took his family to Colombia to visit his wife's family, and Aldrich told the Russians he was being transferred to counter-narcotics, which he thought was the equivalent of being sent to Siberia, since the CIA and the DEA were not willing to admit that they even worked for the same government, because a DEA agent had been tortured and killed in Mexico in 1985 and was thought to have been murdered by a Mexican official working for the CIA. The DEA was on the opposite side of the war on drugs because the CIA was shipping drugs all around the world to fund their fight against the Russians, who had just turned their back on communism, and times were desperate for the future of the CIA. Rising to the task of his new job, Aldrich came up with the Black Sea Initiative, a plan to track heroin coming out of Afghanistan now that the Russians were gone. And Aldrich spent January and February of 1992 planning long trips to Moscow and to Bulgaria and to Turkey, and Aldrich went to Moscow and talked trash about the CIA and passed out dead drunk on the table. Aldrich was given the password to the new CIA software that presented him with whole new horizons in treason, and Aldrich began sending reports to the Russians on diskettes, and when the CIA finally made a move to stop him in May of 1993, they needed the FBI to do it using their wiretaps and video surveillance, because they didn't want to stop Aldrich so much as they wanted to know why. Since the CIA couldn't imagine anyone actually liking the Russians, and couldn't believe anyone would be a traitor just for money. The wiretapping and videotaping began in June of 1993, with 50 people working full-time to follow Aldrich around, and they taped his wife complaining when Aldrich brought her breakfast in bed because the eggs were too hard and the toast was too cold, and they also sorted through his garbage. The FBI had a hard time watching Aldrich because he was being protected by the guards at the CIA building, who prevented anyone from hanging around to watch him come and go from the office. And the rules in the parking lot had become very strict after a man named Mir had opened fire on some CIA agents and escaped back to Pakistan. But most importantly, the CIA didn't want to tell their guards that they were spying on one of their own, so Aldrich was allowed to come and go as he pleased. Both agencies were stretched thin at the time, as the FBI was busy with public relations at Waco, while the CIA was busy with Bill Clinton and Monica. And after 3 months of surveillance, the FBI watched Aldrich deliver a package of secrets to the Russians at 6 o'clock in the morning while the CIA was still sleeping. But all the FBI got was a picture of him coming and going to a covert drop site that could have been just a walk in the park. Aldrich soon flew to Turkey for a week-long conference about drug trafficking in September of 1993. It was supposed to have been held in Moscow, but Constantinople had been close enough. And the conference delegates did a lot of standing around in hotel lobbies because the venue change to Turkey had been made at the last minute. And Aldrich's boss watched a hotel employee try to walk away with Aldrich's laptop and chased him down and got the laptop back. Aldrich's boss turned the laptop on and was shocked to see so many secret files were in it because they were not supposed to carry those sorts of things that could be stolen so easily, and the boss kept the computer for a day just to make Aldrich sweat. If the boss had looked into the computer files rather than just scanning the folder titles, it would have been all over for Aldrich, but the boss was a gentleman and had wanted to respect Aldrich's privacy. While Aldrich was in Constantinople, the FBI agents going through his garbage found a suspicious post-it note in his trash that mentioned an upcoming meeting in Colombia, but the FBI could get no information from the Colombian government about the meeting because the Colombians were very unhappy with the U.S. about the war on drugs. So instead, some FBI agents went down to Colombia to spy on the meeting, but Aldrich had changed his mind and didn't go. So the FBI decided to break into his house without a warrant in October, wearing black clothes and face masks in the middle of the night. The FBI wanted to get a look inside his computer, but the raid was a waste of time, because they had already found a used printer ribbon in his garbage with enough evidence on it to hang Aldrich, but they hadn't gotten around to looking at it because they were too busy planning the break-in. The CIA watched Aldrich go to Colombia again in November, where he sold a packet of documents to the Russians for $50,000, and they finally arrested him on President's Day in February of 1994, and in so doing, found out that the KGB people Aldrich had betrayed had not even asked for money for their services. At his trial, Aldrich made a speech saying that the CIA was a useless and expensive appendage, and many people agreed with him. And Congress would reinstate the death penalty for traitors 6 weeks later. Aldrich said at his trial that he didn't think it was fair for the U.S. to have such an advantage over Russia, and said that he really liked the people of the KGB and thought the Russians were victims like himself. And he said that he wanted the Soviets to see that their problems were of their own making, not the result of CIA sabotage or Western subversion. And the author of Betrayal called this, quote, a magnificently Byzantine idea, close quote, and after Aldrich's odyssey ended, there were many forced retirements at the CIA, starting at around $90,000 a year. While America had been busy with the Great Cold War with Russia, China had gone communist right under everyone's nose, and life in China had been terrible before Mao took over and had quickly gotten worse. Anslinger's office budget in 1959 had been a little over $4 million. And the previous year he had collected over $2 million, quote, in customs duties on legitimate imports, registrations, fines, and forfeited vehicles, close quote. And his office had seized 64 kilograms of heroin in 1958 and 78 kilograms of heroin in 1959, along with 2,145 kilograms of marijuana that had come up from Mexico. Anslinger said that, quote, many of the racketeers meeting at Appalachian, New York in 1957 were narcotics vendors or suspects, close quote, and Anslinger saw that Vito Genovese got 15 years in prison for narcotics violations, and 15 other Italians received 5 years in prison, while 5 others were given lesser sentences for conspiracy to obstruct justice. Anslinger followed that up in 1959 with 10,000 arrests for narcotic drug laws and 70,000 arrests for liquor law violations and 110,000 arrests for driving while intoxicated and over 1 million arrests for drunkenness. And the total number of people in federal and state prison was 207,513, or 119 for every 100,000 citizens. Anslinger would spend his final 3 years on morphine because of chest pain. And after the murder of Bobby Kennedy, the whole mafia thing sort of slunk away. The Bureau of Narcotics became the DEA in the 70s, after the FBM was scrapped in 1968, when the Worms report described widespread corruption at the FBN, and the report was sealed so as not to embarrass the guilty. Worms was the town in Germany where Kriemhild had let the Huns take over. That town surrounded by vineyards from where Liebfraumilch wine first came, and John Connolly was appointed the Secretary of the Treasury in 1971, and he used the IRS to fight heroin sales, and he made $100 million his first year, along with $25 million in property seizures. And the imposed fines and tax penalties were figured by how much the agents believed a person might have made selling the narcotics. Bobby Kennedy had dedicated his book, The Enemy Within, that he'd written in 1960, to a list of people, and Anslinger was among them. And Bobby had hired 2 of Anslinger's agents and worked with the man himself for a while, so it seems unlikely that Anslinger would have been involved in Bobby Kennedy's murder in 1968, but could be easily blamed for it, especially if he had been involved in the murder of JFK in 1963. Lucien Conan, a CIA colonel of Corsican origin who had been deeply involved in the coup that resulted in the assassination of Premier Diem of South Vietnam, was brought into the BNDD, Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, as the head of its strategic intelligence, and the Cuban exile leader Manuel Artemis in Miami, according to Artemis, asked him about the possibility of forming a team of Cuban exile hitmen to assassinate Latin American traffickers. 13 Days, a memoir of the Cuban Missile Crisis by Robert Kennedy, New York Signet Books, New American Library, McCall Corporation, 1968, W. W. Norton, 1969, page 144. The California Supreme Court ruled in 1962 that it was not a crime to be addicted to narcotics, and hippies from around the world flooded into the Golden State. And Anslinger reached retirement age that year, and his final report said that Americans drank 252 million gallons of whiskey in 1962, and that 1 in 5 of those jugs were bootleg moonshine, and that each of those gallons of moonshine whiskey had deprived the U.S. government of $10.50 in taxes, which was why 6,000 stills had been destroyed that year by government revenue agents.